the nub of the argument I want to make today is to differentiate between leader development and leadership development. And the underlying argument being we do far too much leader development and nowhere near enough leadership development. A simple argument with lots of layers of complexity that hopefully we'll go through a bit today. So what do we mean by the two? Well, leader development, I guess, is obvious. It's about developing usually people in charge of stuff to develop their behaviors, their personalities, and to find out more about themselves. So I guess in the traditional, more command days, this was about being more commanding and authoritative. Nowadays, it tends to be about being more relaxed, inclusive, ethical as a person. Yep. Leadership development, I think you can probably guess, is about developing a collective capacity within organizations to offer direction to organizations. Okay, so my argument really is we always tend to revert to default back to leaders and leader development, and we overlook leadership development. And I'm going to argue that there are three kind of underlying tendencies that pull us back to leader development, but there is an alternative. And of course there is a place for leader development, but I'm going to try something a little bit experimental, and in making the argument for leadership development, I'm going to run a kind of mini leadership development session workshop. And actually it doesn't matter if it goes horribly wrong, because we can get some lessons from that. That's kind of the point of leadership development in many ways. In some ways it's better if it goes wrong, because it brings out some of the dynamics in the room. But perhaps for my personal reputation, it's probably better that it goes right. And I'll try and draw out, I think, 4 lessons from this session. And that session is going to be me telling you a story and a little bit of interaction. Okay, so I'm going to outline 3 traps that keep pulling us back to leaders. And I'm a Star Wars fan, and any excuse really to get any kind of Star Wars picture up on the screen I will take. So let's talk first about the sovereignty trap. And I'm sorry to keep coming back to Camila, but she does feature quite heavily in our online courses. It's an extreme case. So let's talk about the sovereignty trap. Sovereignty is usually discussed in political theory in terms of establishing nation states. The argument being, when you first establish a democratic nation state, there's a contradiction at the heart of this founding. The contradiction is you always need a smart person who knows what they're doing and can set the thing up in the first place, can establish a constitution, democratic norms, and so on. So that in times of crisis, so when we're under attack from terrorism, as I've outlined in some research I'm doing at the moment, the tendency is always to revert back to the leader, to the founder. The sovereign will save us. So in other words, there's an undemocratic heart at the center of every democratic or collective group or organization, be that nation state, small charity, big charity, and so on. So my research at the moment is looking into the language of Tony Blair in the run-up to the Iraq War, and it's amazing how frequently he uses the word leadership as a sort of gateway to ask permission for people just to stop scrutinizing him, follow the leader, believe in his kind of moral argument for going to war. Okay? So that's basically the simple argument. And in the case of, I don't have any more knowledge than you do of Kids Company, but to me, as someone who's done a bit of reading around it, it seemed obvious that this organization tended to defer back to the leader in difficult times, trust the leader. Now, this stuff can benefit leaders in some ways. Obviously, it gives them more power, status, prestige, also loneliness, I guess, can also benefit followers. Anyone got any ideas about how it can benefit followers, or followers can feel this is beneficial? Anyone? Precisely. Push the problem onto someone else. And what happens when it goes wrong?
Well, I'm not accountable or responsible, am I?
Get rid of that person. Problem solved. It's the football manager syndrome. Yeah, that's right. I'm a West Ham fan, so I know quite a lot about this stuff. The identity trap. Actually, we're going to play a game of the identity trap. So I'm going to show you 3 excerpts of people talking about political candidates they want to be selected for Parliament. These are public Labour Party posts from members. So I've blocked out identifying information. I want you to tell me, are they talking about a man or a woman? And is it a man or a woman doing the describing? Have a quick read. This is from a Facebook post. Who are they talking about, man or woman? Man, yeah. And who's doing the writing? Okay, they're talking about a woman, and it's a woman doing the writing. Man or woman, they're talking about. It's a woman, and it's a man doing the writing. You've probably got a flavour. So are they talking about a man or a woman? Yeah, okay, but you started to work out the game a bit here, I suppose. They're talking about a woman, and it's a man doing the writing. The point I want to make here is the default language we attribute to leaders, there's loads of research on this actually, tends to default to very masculine traits. So actually it doesn't matter if, in some ways, if we're talking about a man or a woman, which is sometimes why the kind of argument about gender balance on boards and senior management is important, obviously, but kind of misses something else, which is masculine practices. And so we equate leaders with very masculine practices. So the word strength was used, strong candidates, strong debating skills. The word solid was used there, wasn't it? Inspiring, this idea that the great masculine figure can inspire. I can sprinkle you with my beneficence and inspirational qualities. And I can be the change maker. I think it's something like that.
Do you have that those are all masculine words?
Well, they're traditionally associated with not male, masculine. So it's this notion of sharp elbows, being assertive, being super confident, rather than feminine qualities. I'm not talking about men or women, I'm talking masculine and feminine. Feminine qualities, which I suppose would be care, collaboration, support, alternatives. Interestingly, this candidate lost. The person who won demonstrated quite opposite characteristics, I would argue, which can tell you something interesting perhaps about the times we're in, if we had time to go through that. So actually, you'll just notice I was quite masculine in the way I dealt with that question, which is, I was. Yeah, absolutely. So that's because I want to try to keep to time. If this was a leadership development session, I would pause and we would have a proper conversation about it. And there's an ideology trap, which is there's a kind of ideology underlying leaderism, which is that if we develop ourselves and we compete in a marketplace of people who develop these leader characteristics, then that creates and it feeds into this kind of increasingly, I guess I'm going to use the word, neoliberal culture that is sort of in the ascendancy in Britain. So we've written a bit about how this can be described as a kind of romanticizing of leaders, but also leadership. And it's fascinating that even when people talk about collective leadership, actually when you drill down to the practice, even when they're talking about collective groups, you still get back down to units of individuals. Groups allow me to self-express, to be myself, and so on and so forth. There's very little. We seem to have a real difficulty in finding more intersubjective and collective ways of thinking, because it's just outside the scope of lots of our thinking at the moment. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a story. And my argument is that leadership development can help us get over some of this stuff. And I'm going to try to do that through a leadership development story. This is a typical kind of story I would normally deliver at the beginning of a program to get people's voices in the room. But let's just get into the story and we'll unpack it afterwards. So meet Jackie. Jackie is quite a successful solicitor, has built up quite a bank of savings. She's in corporate law, very successful, but she's not really happy and fulfilled. She wants to set up, it's always been her dream actually to set up a coffee business in her hometown. She loves the aroma and the taste of coffee. When she walked into her first Starbucks, she really felt at home, the music, the relaxation, the conviviality, and so on. And she thought her town was missing something a bit more ethical and independent. And that was her passion. She wanted to channel some of her kind of entrepreneurial spirit from her practice and her values into this business. But she knows nothing about coffee. That is quite an important problem, really. So she hits some local kind of chat boards and discovers this guy, Frankie M., who is a real coffee snob, connoisseur, objectionable fellow in many ways, but also a bit of a genius. And he says things like this quite regularly, your cafe's a disgrace. I mean, haven't you heard of taste and balance? And he wears a beret. He's that kind of chap. And but she actually thinks, this guy's got some knowledge, so maybe he's a difficult character. I'll go and meet him. go through my idea, and to cut a long story short, they do go into business together, and they start this startup. And PC Cafe is born. It stands for Pure Coffee Cafe. And anyway, they site it in a nice, convenient location. They really go perhaps slightly overboard in terms of the ethicality and the purity of this place. It's all about the experience from bean to cup being an ethical journey, and everything is by hand. And they're very caring with their employees, and it's a kind of arty feel to this cafe. They draw in local organizations and causes and musicians and whatnot to perform in the cafe. It does very well. It becomes a kind of hub where local important people and subnational people want to come and be seen and be snapped and so on. It becomes quite a trendy thing. But then the recession hits, and this kind of business model tends to struggle in lean times. And to compound matters, Frankie is a difficult character. So he does things like has open conflict with staff if they don't meet his exacting standards. He might expect the staff to argue back, and actually that's kind of how he sees his leadership in this organization. But lots of people aren't comfortable with that. He surveils people when they first start, so he'll often give people fake jobs to do so he can watch them, because he's paranoid about the secrets of the business being given away to competitors. He was quite prone to unilaterally sacking people, even though he technically doesn't have the power to do that. That's Jackie's power. So clearly he's quite an ego-driven bloke. But in the meantime, Jackie has appointed Sandra, who's a kind of, didn't do brilliantly well in school, but financed herself, I'm going to say here, through the OU, and is a real marketing and finance whiz, and is a more realist, if you like, voice inside the company. So there's a kind of balance between Frankie and Sandra. But they argue a lot, as you quite imagine, Frankie and Sandra argue a lot. One day after a particularly explosive argument, Sandra just walks. She just walks out. She's had enough, which is quite distressing for Jackie. But she needs to make a decision. So the business is losing money, despite significant early success. There's actually a new low-cost chain cafes open next door. There's quality coffee, but significantly cheaper. Let's give it a phony name, Pret-a-Manger. So it emphasizes ethicality, but makes compromises. And staff are getting increasingly frustrated and worried about the future, which manifests in complaints about Frankie. So if you were Jackie, what would you do? Okay, ideas. What would you do? You've got to make decisions about this business's future.
Find Sandra.
Rehire Sandra?
Well, find Sandra and find out what she's thinking.
Yeah, okay. Well, okay, there's 2 different points. So we rehire Sandra. Why do you want to rehire Sandra?
Well, we said find Sandra. I think
Find Sandra. All right.
you need to talk to Sandra.
Need to talk to Sandra.
Find out what's going on. That's what.
Yes, okay. So we're going to talk to Sandra. We're going to try to get her to make sense of a situation. Yes, we might rehire Sandra. That was my solution. Anyone else?
Get rid of Frank.
Oh, fire Frank. I like it. Okay. I'm actually colorblind, so I'm supposed to use different colors for this, but actually it just confuses me. So let's fire Frank. Okay, let's spend a couple more minutes. More solutions? Absolutely. Talk to customers. So what would you try to find out from customers? What do they want? Okay, yeah, let's use that. Yep, anyone else? Go back into law, yeah. Yeah, get out now. Good one. Anyone else? Talk to Frankie. Yeah, let's talk to Frankie as well. Yep. Lots of talking. Yeah, good point. There is only one shop at this point, but we could definitely talk to the staff and to the managers. Absolutely. So talk to staff. Go on, let's take 2 more and then we'll stop. Oh, relocate the business, potentially. Yes, good idea. Yeah, I'm trying to work out where to put that one. Somewhere between here. Different branch. Oh, yes. Yes.
Is there a merger with the cafe next door?
Oh, yes, I like that. Consider merger. Oh, so why consider a merger?
Because they're obviously doing something right, and maybe the two together can be a stronger combination.
Yes, good one. Okay. I'm going to put that over two boxes. Anyway, I think that's enough because we're a bit tight for time. So the first thing I'm going to do is just show you what I would do with this after much more time with the group. And then I'm going to unpack three different things from it. So if you were a leadership development group, we would call this first column command, would we not? Fire Frank, hire a consultant. These are the leader in charge who has the knowledge, who disperses that knowledge through chains of command and makes kind of vigorous, assertive decisions. Command is very important, clearly, especially in professional organizations and uniformed organizations. The middle column is management. So you go to known solutions to problems. They might be complicated problems, definitely are complicated problems, but there are management solutions to them. So it's a hiring thing. We'll rehire Sandra, that was mine. Go back to what you know, which is law. Relocate the business, I would argue, is probably a really possibly smart management decision rooted in marketing. Open a different branch. That probably, I would say, goes across command and management. And anyway, and the final column I want to argue is leadership. Interesting that you filled this column out far more than other groups would, and I think that probably says a lot about the voluntary sector. So your instinct, in a way, is counter to the one I put up on the screen, which is kind of awkward for me, but never mind. Talk to Sandra, try to make sense of what's going on in her world, try to maybe broker a solution.
If you're talking to Sandra, you're giving in, isn't it? She walked out.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
Could be somebody else.
Could be.
Sandra was going to the point.
There could be.
I will go back to Sandra.
Yeah. So that would be the counterpole of management, wouldn't it? That would be the counterpole of management. Your experience as a manager tells you that there's other people who could do this stuff. Anyway, but a leadership solution might be to try to make sense of why she's walked out and maybe try to broker a solution. You would try to get bottom-up solutions from customers. And maybe when you're talking to Frankie, try to make sense of how conflict can be harnessed for sort of more constructive ends. So I guess if I was doing there it is. I guess if I was doing a leadership program, the first thing to note here would be, that leadership development really works best when it's done as part of a real organization. So leader development tends to pull individuals out of their organizations and develop them, in isolation, and then puts them back in again, off you go. How much of this stuff would you notice in your own organizations, I suppose, would be an opening question. How easy is it for people to fall out, to have different opinions, or what mechanisms do you have for making that stuff work? And sometimes using a fictional story helps in that sense because it's a kind of safer way into this stuff. That being said, it's not really a fictional story. It's Apple, but re-envisaged as a coffee story. So anyway. But you can see lots of your own practices in these kinds of organizations. Another thing I might think about doing in this situation is restorying this. What do I mean by restorying? Well, we told the story from Jackie's perspective, but maybe I fell into the leader trap, actually, when I was doing that. Did I not? Maybe there were different perspectives that could have given a very different thing here. You could also notice some identity trap work at play here. Why did I have the sensible, kind of inclusive, person as a woman? Of a certain age, Jackie. Actually, we use this case study in a course we're developing at the moment that's going to go live in October, and we flip the gender roles. So the erratic, crazed genius, very masculine, is a woman in our case study. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how students engage with that. They might find that challenging. I hope they do find it challenging, because it will get us to some meaningful conversations, I think. And the final thing I guess this story would do is it would help bring up practices. So we got there a little bit, didn't we? The importance of conversations, the importance of conflict, and the fact that leadership isn't always the answer. Maybe there are other solutions at different times. So that would give us a template to move on, and as a group inside an organization, to develop a different kind of leadership together in quite practical ways. I think what also comes out of this is the fact that leadership is perhaps not actually for everyone, and it's quite a hard thing for organizations to admit, because leadership is quite a sexy word that comes with prestige and all kinds of other things. But maybe these practices of leadership aren't actually for everyone. Maybe what they want is better command training or better management training or no training at all. Maybe some of this stuff is just too hard or inappropriate. I've done some research with a colleague of mine in New Zealand. I used to work in the New Zealand Leadership Institute, developing leadership with groups. We published this in Management Learning at the tail end of last year. And we went back through participant reflections. They were people from business, the voluntary sector, public sector, a real range, actually, and looked at their experiences of being in a leadership development program rather than a leader program. And what we found is their experiences actually were intrinsically aesthetic. These weren't programs where we introduced arts-based methods of drawing and acting and that kind of thing to develop leadership, although those methods can be really useful. But nevertheless, they kept bringing heavily aesthetic lenses to their experiences. So they described their experiences in leadership development, working together with colleagues in this environment, as getting these partial glimpses of insight. Yeah? But this partiality kind of quickly dissipated away as they made sense of stuff together in teams. It was heavily disruptive work because it got them to ask fundamental questions about, as a group, what was the kind of identity they were creating and what were they defaulting to. So actually it got to quite difficult places for them. And that it was also about sensation. These were things, experiences they could feel and touch. The experience of being together through an experience was quite powerful. So these are intrinsically aesthetic experiences. So I guess if these are not experiences you're particularly comfortable with, then perhaps leadership isn't the correct way forward. But if these are things we want to develop in teams to offer collective direction and capacity, then this is probably an under-examined area of practice.